My name is Martin Jones, and this video is coming to you from holographicbreathing.com, and this video is of a tutorial that I gave for cranial osteopaths and craniosacral therapists. And this is the second video in a series of tutorials where I show the more cranial side of holographic breathing and the more holographic side of holographic breathing. This particular tutorial we're looking, or I'm showing, a new way of viewing the whole central nervous system and nerves, which makes sense and is deeply healing for this whole area and helps people to evolve in their own energies and their own process. At the end of this tutorial there is a meditation where we use holographic breathing to help heal the cells and the cranial fluid of this whole area. If you wish to learn holographic breathing, there is a link below to the previous tutorial where I also teach holographic breathing. So, we're going to look at the formation of cranial fluid and a holistic way of looking at that whole paradigm. Now, I learned holographic breathing I learned craniosacral therapy a long time ago, so it may even now be taught in the way I'm going to show it to you. I don't know, but you can put me right or give me feedback anyway. But when I was taught, really, when people talk to the cranial fluid, it was the fluid in the ventricles, down the centre of the brainstem, and the fluid around the cranium and around the whole spinal cord, and all held within the dural sheath, and that is what was thought of as the cranial fluid. And some people said that they felt cranial fluid went off down through the nerves, but there was no scientific proof of that. So I had that image, and when holographic breathing came through, I was very ill with Lyme's disease, and I wanted to work with my brain and central nervous system to help heal that. And when I allowed that to happen, I just had a completely different internal picture, which was the whole fluid of the whole brain was cranial fluid, and the fluid around it was cranial fluid. It was all cranial fluid, and that it freely and easily flowed off down through the nerves, which added a much bigger picture of the potency of the cranial fluid and the amount of cranial fluid you're dealing with. So I had that image, and I was happy with that, and just did it for myself with that. And then I would teach in that way. But then coming to make Seminar 4, which is about the tongue and how it relates to everything, we work with the cranial fluid in that, and with the brain, and with the nervous system, and with the nerves. And because I was going to put it on video, I thought, well, actually, I've got to do some research. And first of all, I thought, well, okay, they must be right, they're scientists, they know it's like this. So I started doing it in that way, and just having it all sealed in the dural membrane around the whole central nervous system, nothing getting out through the nerves, and just in the ventricles and around. And with holographic breathing, you get this lovely opening and closing of the temporal bones. And if you look at the side view of the cranium, the top, pretty well, the top of the temporal bones, they follow the lateral ventricles. So you get from the side this nice picture, and as it opens up sideways and closes it, you get this really lovely breath in the lateral ventricles. So I was being with that and just having it all contained, and so I thought, you know, this is how it is, just, you know, for how many centuries that's how they've taught it. And what happened, it was producing lots more cranial fluid because I was breathing with it and the lateral ventricles were working. And what happened, it just got more and more congested. And you know, when you, I think it's called encephalitis, where the cranium started happening. It was like my cranium, I could feel the plates were coming apart and this cranial fluid was building up, and I was trying to keep it all held in the, and this actually shows the power of visualization. And I was trying to keep that all contained in the dural membrane. It just kept expanding, and I could feel my head starting to expand. And in the end, I just let go of it, and I literally felt the cranial fluid flowing off down through the nerves. So my whole cranium shrank back down, that whole system settled down, and suddenly, not only was it moving out through the nerves, suddenly I was able to breathe. With it all, with that system just contained within the dural membrane, I couldn't breathe properly. As soon as it was spreading out through the nerves, I could take lovely deep breaths. So I just thought, I'm doing it my way, and as far as I'm concerned, that's proved it to me. But then I thought, well, it would be nice to actually really investigate this and see how it does actually work. And very quickly, on the investigating of it, and when I looked at the basic principles of how the body works and cranial fluid, it was proving how I experienced it was correct. That the cranial fluid in the ventricles and around the brain is the same as the cranial fluid within the brain. That they are the same thing. And then, so it is a big mass of fluid. And as I say, I experienced it moving off down through the nerves. So I started looking into that, and there's nothing at all to stop that fluid flowing off down the nerves. So then, because I didn't image it, because when it flows off down the nerves, it has to stay as cranial fluid. But as there's a blood supply and connective tissue and all the different things, you've gone through the blood-brain barrier, so it's out, so you have everything else. Looking for a way that it stayed cranial fluid, because it had that quality of cranial fluid flowing down through the nerves. So I'm going to show you the drawings. So I had to start, because there wasn't any anatomy to show what I was feeling. I started painting my own pictures of it. And I've never painted beyond rubbish at painting, but because somehow I was channeling the pictures, I started off, I just need one of that, one of that. And every time I finished one, the next morning I'll be waking up, and you start in that space between sleep and waking up is a really good time to receive information, because the mind hasn't kicked in. I'd start getting the information about, oh fuck, sorry, I've got to paint another picture. And this whole thing unraveled. And so we can't go through it all today, but we can go through the basis of it, and that will give us enough to view our brain, our central nervous system, our nerves, in a way that we can connect to the breath with it and feel the different qualities of the fluids there and of the neural tissue. But before we do that, before we start looking at the pictures, there's one thing that I just will give a demonstration of. A bottle of water. And if we compare it to the body to start off with, if this is the blood flow coming out of the heart around the body, it goes out, very strong, lot of pressure behind it, and that goes out, it's got all the oxygen, and it comes back same volume as venous, the venous blood coming back to the heart. But when it goes through however many I think 100,000 miles of capillaries, something like that. And the pressure has gone down so that it's about 1/10 of the pressure. So it flows back to the heart much more slowly. So even though it's the same volume, not as much fluid or blood can get back to the heart as is coming out. And the rest that goes back comes back as lymph. And this is the lymph. There is twice as much lymph as the total volume of blood. Arterial blood leaving the heart, the venous blood is that much, and twice as much is lymph. There's twice as much lymph as the whole blood supply. Now, the same thing, I mean, again, people give me feedback because I couldn't find any information on it, but the same thing is happening in the brain. It needs a lot of oxygen, it needs a continual circulation. You've got the blood coming to it, very strong pressure, then the venous blood coming back much, much slower. And as it leaves the brain and is going through the venous sinuses, it is actually going so slowly there that it actually goes backwards sometimes. So it's going to be about the same. That the amount of blood that's leaving the heart can't come back via the venous blood, and you're going to end up with the same amount. But in the brain it's not lymph, it's cranial fluid. So you end up with this amount of cranial fluid that needs to get back to the heart, which can't go back through the venous blood. There is no scientific explanation to where that fluid goes. None. The only bit of information I've got on that I could find on that was a discussion that saying this has been talked about for centuries, what happens to the offlow from the blood going to the brain, and nobody has been able to find that. And then they had a bit of more advancing where they'd put radioactive ions in it or something like that, and they'd found the ions had travelled into the nerves. If that doesn't come back through the blood, there is no other way out of the central nervous system other than outwardly, through the dural membrane or down through the nerves. There's just no other exit. That is it. There isn't a lymph system leaving the brain, or there may be very fine ones, but there's not twice the amount of the arteries and veins leaving. So you get that much blood coming very fast and strong to the brain, you get that much venous blood coming out very slowly, and then you're left with this amount of cranial fluid moving much more slowly. And my experience of it is that it flows down through the nerves. And my experience of it is that it stays as cranial fluid. And now I'm going to show you, does that make sense to people? Is that kind of what you're taught, or is that new? I would like to add some information to this video just to clarify what I'm explaining at this point. There's a large supply of blood through the arteries to the whole central nervous system. Some of the arteries and blood goes to the choroplexus, which produces cranial fluid and travels through the ventricles. The major arteries and blood goes to the interior of the whole central nervous system, where it gets smaller and becomes capillaries, and the cranial fluid is filtered out of the capillaries through the endothelial cells. They work as little filters to create the cranial fluid for the whole body of the central nervous system. So you have some of the blood going to the choroplexus and to the ventricles, creating cranial fluid, and then you have a larger amount of blood going to the whole body of the central nervous system into the capillaries, where it's also creating cranial fluid. So you have two supplies of cranial fluid, one from the coryplexus, one from the capillaries. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well let's, the pictures I've made, put it in a holistic way that just makes it simple and just makes sense to me and is scientifically actually proven. And the first thing, that before we go to the first thing about cranial fluid, and I didn't know this, when I started looking into it and I was comparing the cranial fluid in the ventricles and the cranial fluid in the brain, I can't remember how it was described on Thomas's course, but I know on Franklin's course they kept on referring to it as the most refined fluid in the body, and I didn't really know what that was. But when I found out what that actually means, it was like a light turned on. When you say something is the most refined fluid in the body, that means it's nearly water. You're talking about salt water. Cranial fluid is 99% water. Salt, oxygen, glucose, it'll have carbon dioxide when it's working with the cells, and a few other things. But it is 99% water. Now, if you're or even more, salt probably 99.5% salt water. Now, if you're using it for energy work and feeling, for me, the water is probably the most important part. It's alive, it's got a memory, light travels through it, energy travels through it, it's an alive thing. So, and there is no difference. In the ventricles it's 99.5% salt water, and in the brain it's 99.5% salt water. So on that respect they're exactly the same. There's no difference. But there's one big difference actually. In the brain it's being used. The oxygen, the glucose is feeding the cells, and carbon dioxide is being given off. In the ventricles, it's not being used, and I'm not going to cover that today because there's a reason for that, which I'll go into later. But anyway, I've painted these pictures that make it look easy enough. So the brain is, now when a person is dead it becomes quite hard, but in a living person the brain has the constitution of jelly. It's like soft jelly, and it is 90% water, and the fluid in it is 99% water. The cranial fluid is like, so here within the brain you have the fluid 99% water, salt, oxygen, glucose, and that's feeding these cells. Okay, so here we have the ventricle. This is 99% water, salt, oxygen, glucose. Now, these are ependymal cells joining the two. These are completely open. There's loose connections through that, so there's an easy flow of fluid backwards and forwards. These ependymal cells, they make a whole lining to the ventricles, down through where it goes down through the centre of the spine like a skin, and then where they come together they make folds and make the coryplexus, and then they become tight connections, so only pure water and nothing else can come through, and that's important. We'll look at that in a bit. But basically this is water and this is water. It is the same. It is the same thing. So when you're viewing the brain, you can view the ventricles, if you're viewing the fluid, it's not just here, it's here as well. And this is like the formation of the brain is very loose. It's not like the cells are very compact in any way. They're just joined together by tentacles, and these astrocyte cells what hold it all together. Otherwise it would just be a fluid. your brain would just be slurping around like a fluid. So it is more like the sea, and the cells are like seaweed moving in the water. And these astrocyte cells will give it a basic structure. These are two capillaries that produce the cranial fluid. These are microglial cells. These are like in your blood you have T cells. These are the same thing. They will float around the brain and they will heal things, and they will kill any infections, but they have an intelligence. Say one part of your brain, if there's an aneurysm or if there's an infection, they will just all cart off to that part of your brain, gather around it and fix it. But they're not travelling through the lymph, it's just an open system. So those are the immune system for it. Then we have the neurons, and the neurons are connected, I can't remember the name of these tubes, there's something or other tube, but they're connected together. And here we have two connections from other neurons connecting to this neuron, and they make this network through the whole brain, and then that is what becomes the nerve. So these tubes, they'll have one neuron, and then like for your arm, right, they'll have that one cell, and this tube that's coming off it, that'll be the whole length of your arm right up to your finger, so it can be incredibly long nerve, axon, yeah, or nerve fibers. And then around the axon we have the myelinated glial cells. Now this is, we're going to look at all the others, but this is the one we're going to look at. I'll just wait for, these are the ones we're going to look at for how it stays as cranial fluid as it moves down through the nerves. So I think that's enough for that picture. I think we've done all of that. So very quickly, and again we can go into this more, to understand the myelinated glial cells, we've got to understand how the cranial fluid is produced. So within the brain, this is a capillary, and this is an endothelial cell. And what this has is close connections. This is the nucleus, and these red bits are close connections. Now it's so tight that only pure water can come out. So pure water will come out through those connections. And one thing that makes me laugh when people say cranial fluid can't flow down the nerves or can't flow out through the dural membrane, water will flow through any membrane, any cell, anywhere in the body. If the pressure is high on one side, the water will flow through whatever is in the way and come out through the other side. Everything in your body is porous in that way. So the water can flow out through these tight connections, and it's the only thing that can flow out through it. The water will flow out just straight through the cell walls from the blood, and then these cells, they will allow safe passage across from this inner wall of the cell to the outer wall. They will allow oxygen, glucose, some different minerals and salt, and that is how you end up with 99% water and salt and glucose basically. Here we have it as a cross section. So we've got the blood and the water coming out and the different nutriments coming out. So that's how the cranial fluid is created in the brain. So now in the coryplexus we have the same ependymal, cuboidal ependymal cells. And now what's happened is they've come much tighter together, so as the skin for the whole ventricles is made of this, but they're open. But as soon as it becomes the coryplexus, they come together tightly. And you've got the blood supply, which is held in the pockets of these coryplexus. It seals it off because you can't have the nutriments that are coming out of the capillaries there and entering into the cranial fluid. And so you have all the water, the different things coming out of the capillaries, and then they're held in this bag of cells. And these will let just pure water through the gaps, and pure water will just go straight through the cells as well. So you get pure water coming into the ventricles. And then the same as around the capillaries in the brain, in the ventricles these cells will allow safe passage of oxygen, salt, glucose and some few other minerals. So it does the same job as the cells around, just around the capillaries in the brain, but here is slightly different. It leaves this space. And the difference in this is that because the cranial fluid from the brain can flow into the ventricles because it's porous, this works both ways. These breathe, that this will, when carbon dioxide or toxins come into the ventricles, the water and toxins can come back out here, can come through the ependymal cells this way. The water can come through and the ependymal cells will take out carbon dioxide and toxins, and that all comes into this space, and the venous blood takes that back off to the heart. So that's kind of how the cranial fluid in the ventricles work. But also it's filtering back, because it's porous. They're porous. It can allow the fluid from the brain to flow in and out of it. So it needs to, it breathes, it goes both ways through the coriplexus.
And presumably it's also taking across hormones and neurotransmitters.
Pardon?
And presumably it's also hormones and neurotransmitters.
Very likely, yes. I mean, not something I read, but presumably all the things
that are communicated throughout our bodies.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's called the blood-brain barrier because it stops pretty well everything except for the cranial fluid. But anything that is used for the brain and the operation of the brain is allowed through. And I guess it regulates itself to the quantities of that. So, but the main constituencies are salt for the firing of the neurons, glucose to feed the cells, oxygen to feed the cells, and then carbon dioxide is taken back through the venous blood. So that is how it's produced in the ventricles, and that is how it's produced in the brain. Now we come to my favourite little cells, myelinated glial cells. So this is the only other place where you have a tight connection that will only let through pure water. This is a cross-section, with the outside and the cross-section through the axon, and this is a tight connection. It will only let in pure water and out pure water. And here where the fold comes together, this is also a tight connection. It will only let in pure water. This is a cross-section, so you've got the tight connection here. This just lets pure water in and out, and there should also be a little tight connection there. But you can see how much of the myelinated glial cell is actually cranial fluid. They talk of the myelinated glial cell as a rubbery sheath around the axon, but actually it's more than 50%, a lot more than 50% actually cranial fluid. And it's an alive cell, and for me, a theory, I mean it's all theories on the brain, nobody really knows particularly what's going on. My theory is it works the same, it's a filter, the same way as the endothelial cells around the capillaries are a filter that's creating the cranial fluid, and that the one for the ventricles, coriplexus is a filter for producing cranial fluid. I think these, or my experience of these, is that they also create and filter cranial fluid, that it lets in pure water, and then through the outside of the shell it also lets in pure water, it lets in oxygen, glucose and things to feed this cell, and also to feed the axon in the middle, and then eliminates the carbon dioxide. But is creating its own environment of cranial fluid around the axon. Here you can see it from the side, the axon going through the middle. See how it opens up into these beautiful cells. The geometry of these cells is just beautiful, and the geometry creates an energy. We'll go into that later on. We're just doing it as a very general thing at this time. Now, let's actually come to that in a minute. So, let's just see.
Because the way that I was taught about myelination in psychology is that it's like insulation around an electrical wire. That the purpose of the myelination is to allow the conductivity along the neurons to be maximized, because obviously it's passing electricity down neurons, and that if it didn't have that myelination, so in multiple sclerosis, it's the breakdown of the myelination that causes the problem. Is then
I have a different theory.
Yeah.
So I tell you, I mean, that can be true. It can be that, but the cranial fluid in the myelinated seal is not an insulation. Maybe the body of it is an insulation, but I'll tell you what my theory on that is. If you look at this one, so when the electricity travels through a piece of myelinated axon, it will travel 50 times as quickly as non-myelinated, because when it's non-myelinated, the electricity creates a large wave pattern around the axon because it's not protected in any way, so it just doesn't travel as fast. Now, you've got all of this cranial fluid in here, which is salt water, which is a perfect conductor. So my theory isn't that this is just an insulation. Oh, come on. Isn't that it's just an insulation? My theory is what this spirals out, and I think the electricity isn't travelling so much through the axon, that the electricity comes into the axon but expands out through the cranial fluid, and rather than making a big wave that it would make around an uninsulated one, it's the myelinated cell is going around. That wave-like pattern coils out, so it doesn't go so far, but it's going to travel. Salt water is the perfect conductor. But my thought is that it's going to travel through the coils of salt water in that cell faster than the axon, and that's why it travels so quickly. That's my. So you can also, you see, if you view that internally, right, and you're viewing a nerve going out through your body, and you view it as an axon surrounded by a bit of fatty tissue to insulate it, you get a completely different experience to if you visualize an axon traveling out as a nerve that's surrounded by myelinated glial cells that are producing cranial fluid and making a river of cranial fluid traveling down your nerve. That is two totally different experiences. And if I breathe and feel the cranial, or you can't, there isn't a conduction for cranial fluid to move down the nerves if you visualize it in that way. And one of the reasons these are, so, for me, so open to breaking down is not so much the insulation from the outside, because if you break this outer skin, it will still have the same amount of layers of insulation between it and this. But if you break that outer skin, you completely break down the whole production and integrity of the cranial fluid within that cell as a living organism. So rather than viewing it as a bit of flat fatty tissue around the cell, you can view it as an organism, which it is, that has created cranial fluid, which it does, which makes a coil of cranial fluid. Now, whether that makes it travel faster through the axon or not, or whether the electricity travels through the cranial fluid, as I think it does, doesn't really matter. In the end, it's how you view it and how you view it internally, because for what we're doing, it doesn't really matter how the electricity travels down it. So let's go on from that. So let me just find that, because I'm just leading towards something here. Where is it? Is that it?
Is there a way that that can help people with MS?
Pardon?
Is there a way that thinking about the myelination in that way, can it help people with MS?
We're going to do that. When we get onto the meditation bit, we're going to do that. So here we have the cranial fluid from the body of the brain, from the subarachnoid space around the brain, dropping down around the spine, and then for me this comes out down through the nerves. So this is it dropping. There you have the horse's tail, all these long nerves, and the dural sheath all around there. And here we have the nerve. This is the spinal cord coming down here. These are the bodies, I forgot what they're called.
Cell bodies.
Pardon?
Cell bodies of the neurons.
The L bodies.
Cell bodies.
Cell bodies, thank you, Andrew. The cell bodies of the neurons, which, and here in the middle you've got this central body of cranial fluid coming down from the brain and from the ventricles. And then you get these single axons that go off and travel the whole length of an arm, the whole length of a limb, or out to organs. So they're incredibly long for how wide they are. And they have these myelinated glial cells. And there is no membrane, nothing, to stop the fluid from here travelling down here. There's nothing. So to say cranial fluid can't flow down the nerve, why? You know, why would that be? The pia mater is very thin. Cranial fluid can flow from here into there and down. It can flow through here and down. The fluid from within the body of the spinal cord can flow down. There's nothing to stop that fluid flowing down through the nerves. Now the thing is, if it's flowing down between these myelinated glial cells, it's getting into the connective fibre, and it will just stop. It won't get very far. And there's also the blood supply as you start getting out. But something very interesting happens, and it may have already started here. I'm not sure exactly what point it starts, but something very interesting happens. As we come down into the cells, the myelinated glial cells, they join together. And there's thousands of little tentacles joining each one of these together. And for me, these become capillaries for the cranial fluid to flow down and around the cells. Why is it doing that? Every time I look away, it changes.
There
we go. And these are, you can't really draw these to true length. These, the myelinated glial cells, they're 100 times as long as they're wide. So if it's that wide, they're about that long. So they're very long cells. The water, if you think of cranial fluid as water, these are tight connections. It can flow straight through here. Through these tentacles, the only reason I can see for all these tentacles between each one, it's not space to draw them all in, is that it massively increases the surface area between each cell. So within the bodies of the cell, water can flow through those tentacles into the tentacles of these and join into this. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
And then these become rivers of cranial fluid that are protected. They've got tight junctions all the way around, so only pure water can come in, only the nutriments that the cell wants can come in, and then the cell can let off carbon dioxide, whatever. So what the myelinated glial cells in the nerves will do will create cranial fluid. Not only will they make a river of cranial fluid that can travel along the nerves, they will also create their own cranial fluid. So this is a cross section. So there's a blood supply to the connective tissue all around here. And that will be producing oxygen and all sorts of things that wouldn't normally be allowed in the neural place, in the brain and within in the neural tissue. So there's an absolute seal around the myelinated glial cells. But they will let in pure water and they will choose their own nutrition. So they will produce their cranial fluid. How I feel it is happening, I mean, this is a theory, but it's just as much a theory as anything else you will hear about this. And it's also very pretty, as you can see. It makes a nice pattern.
Oh, you're a good painter.
It's amazing, isn't it? I didn't know I could do it. I think I'm just very good structurally, really. And now this works in the same way as the choroid plexus. In the choroid plexus, you get the blood supply, both the venous and from the arteries, coming into an open place, and then the endothelial cells will take out the water and the nutriment they want, and it will go into the ventricles, and then the carbon dioxide will go back the other way, and the venous blood will take it off. So it works the same way as it works in the choroid plexus, as in the nerve. So it will produce rivers that are, and it makes with, see, the myelinated glial cells can wrap round over 100 times around the neuron, and so it has this spiral of both membrane and cranial fluid, and this makes the perfect environment for capillary action. So for me, it can be drawn along the nerves as capillary action. There's about the same difference between the nodes of these capillaries as there are in the lymph. It's a very similar picture to how the lymph is drawn to the heart. So for me, that is how not only can the cranial fluid flow down the nerves, it can stay as cranial fluid, and the nerves can produce more cranial fluid, so they produce their own environment around the neural tissue, which is the axon and the myelinated glial cell. And they come together, the joints come together and seal, so there's no space between them for the fluids and proteins and whatever to get at the neutron, the axon. So for me, this produces its own cranial fluid, it makes a river, and yeah. Anyway, you can see what I'm talking about. And there's an interesting thing for me as well. Going. The other place you have a similar way of feeding, like, is in the placenta, where you have that you have both the arterial blood and the venous blood coming into a space, and then the nutriments being taken out from that space and the toxins, but it's in the placenta. And if you look at this picture, I don't know why I drew it, but I just did it, and it's a front view of the ventricles. There, these are the lateral, the central ventricle, the whatever this, what's this, the third ventricle, fourth ventricle. Then this is the thalamus, this is whatever the thing under the thalamus is called, this is the pons, these are the two halves of the cerebellum. A lot of people look at that and they kind of see a very feminine image, or image of the female genitalia. And you've got the choroplexus working in the same way as a placenta. And for me, the cranial fluid in this whole area is the same, scientifically or chemically, as the cranial fluid here or in the cerebrum here, but it has a very different quality. For me, it's actually much darker. It's much darker and has the quality of creation. In the ventricles, for me, there's that very deep, quiet space of creation, and the okay, closing your eyes. Now, just before we start, because the computer's turned off, just check in your mind's eye. Remember the first picture that showed all the neuron, all the glial cells? Just check in your mind's eye, can you visualize the, what are they called? Astrocyte cells. It's like little octopuses with hundreds of tentacles that go out and connect to everything. This is like the structure that holds it all together. Then you've got capillaries running through it. Then there's microglial cells, which are like little fish swimming through the ocean, are the immune system for it. And then there's neurons with their long axons connecting to other neurons in lots of different ways. And then there's the myelinated glial cells along the axons. So just check in your mind's view that you can do that, and that it is spacious. It's 90% water. It's like a sea. The brain is like a sea that you can swim through. There's space between these nerves. They're joined by tentacles, so there's space there. And it has the fluidity of jelly, and it would just be liquid. Without the astrocyte cells which hold everything together, it would just be fluid. So just notice you can visualize that yourself. And start doing holographic breathing. The lips are closed with a gentle seal. The tongue is on the roof of the mouth with a gentle seal. On the in-breath, the jaw gently opens, and on the out-breath, the jaw gently closes. You feel this relaxation traveling through your whole body. And this breath travels through your whole body. With your whole body, every cell is breathing. Let the awareness rise up into the sinuses in the middle of the face and the nasal passageways in the middle of the face. As I say, we're taking a little bit of a leap here, but hopefully it'll be okay. This part of the face relates a lot to the cranial fluid. Notice these large maxillary sinuses, if you're aware of those. They relate a lot to the lymph in the body, in the brain. They relate to the cranial fluid in the ventricles and within the brain itself. Nasal passageways are more to do with the heart, and they relate to the blood circulation in the brain. So there's centre of the face relates to the fluids in the brain. And from the large maxillary sinuses, notice, see if you can just drop back and be aware of the quality of cranial fluid in the brain and travelling down the spinal cord and in the subarachnoid space and in the ventricles. Notice this cranial fluid, and notice it has a bright, sparkly quality to it. And it's breathing, it's opening and closing, the cranium is opening and closing, the spine is opening and closing. So with holographic breathing you can journey through your anatomy. Notice if you can be aware with this gentle breath, being aware of the cranial fluid. Notice it fills the whole brain, the ventricles, the brain itself, and it's like a sea. The cells of the brain are like seaweed. And as that builds up, allow that to travel off down through your nerves, down through the myelinated glial cells in your nerves, out through your whole body. And notice as it comes into the nerves, notice how more deeply your breath becomes when you allow that fluid to travel off down through your nerves. Suddenly you can breathe more deeply. To keep the holographic breathing going, that's what allows you to journey. Relax the back of the neck, relax the back of the head. And then just be aware of this cranial fluid, just have it inside the whole dural membrane and not have it in the nerves for a while. Notice what that feels like, so you're just aware of the cranial fluid through the whole central nervous system in the brain and the spine. Breathe with that. Notice what it feels like. Notice the depth of your breath. And then allow it to flow off down through the nerves. Notice what happens when you allow that to flow off down through the nerves. Notice what happens to the breath if it gets any deeper as it flows off through the nerves. And now in your mind's eye and in that whole area, become aware of the myelinated glial cells and the cranial fluid inside these cells. They have a feeling like they are breathing. They're opening and closing, and they're filtering cranial fluid for their internal system around the axon, so through the whole brain, through the whole spinal cord. Feel these little cells breathing, that they have these spirals of cranial fluid and they're little filters, and they're breathing cranial fluid. And then that these travel off down through the nerves like rivers, creating their own cranial fluid and being capillaries. This is a wonderful way to heal the myelinated glial cells. Notice there's a brightness to these cells. You may feel a flickering in the eyes. It's a higher cranial fluid. It rises up the face into the ethmoid and into the eyes a bit. They're much brighter, the cranial fluid, or for me, the cranial fluid within the myelinated glial cells, because of the geometry, has a brightness to it. And it rises up the face a bit, into the eyes a bit. It's a higher energy. And then becoming aware of all the astrocyte cells through the whole central nervous system, holding everything together. You might find this much more grounded. It's much more to do with the mouth. These are the connective tissue. These are like the bones and muscles for the brain. They hold it all together as you breathe. They're floating in cranial fluid like seaweed, joining everything to everything. But there's a groundedness to them. They still communicate. And then these connect to the connective tissue running down through the nerves. To notice the quality of the astrocyte cells. This is more the lower body, the mouth, and the lower body for the central nervous system. And then coming back up, being aware of the nasal passageways. This relates to the heart and the capillaries in the brain and the production of cranial fluid. Being aware of the capillaries floating in cranial fluid, in the ventricles, cranial fluid in the ventricles and the whole brain, and the spinal cord. And then the little microglial cells swimming through this sea of cranial fluid. The cells are like seaweed. What we're going to move on to now has a very different quality to it. Start becoming aware of the neurons. We move from the cranial fluid that has a lovely connection to the higher self and the earth. When we start coming into the neurons, has a very particular quality. It's much more solid. It also has a bit the quality of the intellect. Being aware of these neurons, these long axons and these bodies floating in cranial fluid, and you might feel an electricity here, like electrical pulses travelling through the neurons, through the brain, through the spinal cord, then off down through the nerves. Can be a bit of a funny gestalt, because quite often we think we are these, we think we are the thoughts, we think we are the intellect. We sit here, and as we become aware of this, have to sit back a bit, make a lot of space, and that they're floating in cranial fluid. I quite often see little electrical charges moving through these, and these become our patterns, our thoughts. But as you sit with that, the bottom end is the intellect, and this rises and becomes a connection to the higher energies through these neurons. So the kundalini, for me, travels through these, as well as the cranial fluid. So you have the cranial fluid, that is one part, and then the neurons. It's a bit like a yin-yang, and the cranial fluid bathes neurons. So you remember to breathe with the holographic breathing. This will let you travel through this. And there's liberation from sitting back and just watching the charges travel through these neurons. And notice they connect to the eyes. The fluid connects to the sinuses and nasal passageways. The neurons are a bit higher. Notice how they connect to the eyes and to the ethmoid. And then being aware, it will have a very different feel to it. It's hard to disassociate them from each other. Be aware of the myelinated glial cells around the neurons, the the, 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 yin yang, to the axons and this electrical charge. They bathe it, they hold it, they balance it, and they're both to do with the eyes and the ethmoid, the upper face. And travelling off down through the nerves. Breathe. Just be aware of all of that. All of those nerves floating in cranial fluid like seaweed, travelling off down through the nerves, creating their own cranial fluid and making their own rivers. And as it spreads out through the body, it will connect to the more earthly energies. You might feel a dark energy from our bones, from our lower centres, travelling up through the nerves, up through the spine, up through the brain. And you may also feel a higher energy from the higher self coming down into the neurons, coming down into the cranial fluid, bathing this whole area. Being aware of the jaw and mouth, and being aware of the astrocyte cells. This will ground it. This will give it a grounding. Being aware of the jaw, the pelvis, the soles of the feet, the body, connection to the earth. I'm going to gently carry on breathing. I'm going to close this now, so sending a thank you to the earth, sending a thank you to the higher self, and thanking yourself for participating. And you'd have created an energy, letting that energy go off for love and healing to the earth, for love and healing to the higher self, letting it go off for love and healing to all sentient beings, and you are a sentient being, allowing yourself to be loved and healed. Okay, so you can allow yourself to come back. So that is the end of this video. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and share it. There will be more videos in this series. If you would like to receive those videos, subscribe to my YouTube channel, then you'll automatically receive the further videos in this series. Okay, thank you.